and welcome to Hidden Behind the Music Stand. I'm your host, Patty Ryan, and with me is Paul Novak, who is a composer and current PhD student at the University of Chicago under the tutelage of Augusta Reed Thomas. He was selected for a 2022 Charles Ives Scholarship from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and has an upcoming premiere of an orchestral work at Carnegie Hall with the American Composers Orchestra. Other recent collaborators include the Austin Symphony, Orlando Philharmonic, Black Box Ensemble, Sandbox Percussion, Kinetic Ensemble, Left Coast Chamber Ensemble, among many others. His music immerses listeners in a shimmering and subtly crafted musical world, guided by a sense of empathy for the performers playing his music. And we'll be talking about poetry. Welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Patty. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so good to see your face again, because the last time we actually were together was back in October of 2022, where Kinetic, but four of us, including myself, performed your string quartet. A string quartet is like a flock of birds. That's the title.
Yeah, no, I had such an amazing time working with you that week. And I feel like the last day we saw each other was maybe the most intense day, too, which is where the four musicians, including Patty, who played my quartet, recorded for like 10 straight hours in Rice's concert hall.
Yes,
and then we all got dinner afterwards.
Yeah, that was fun, although I had to go straight to the airport. So we were recording Paul's piece for Kinetic's upcoming debut album, which I believe will be released in 2023 sometime. I'm not quite sure what month it is, but I will get back to you listeners when I get more information. But it's very exciting. So Paul's piece is going to be on that. So make sure to take a listen and definitely follow Kinetic. Is that a good plug?
I'm so excited for that. Yeah, it's a great plug. Yeah, Kinetic is amazing. Some of my favorite musicians to collaborate with. Yeah, it's going to be an awesome album.
Yeah, well, and also that's a really great segue into how we know each other, because you used to intern for Kinetic when Kinetic was a young ensemble, and most of us were still students at Rice University.
Yeah, that's true. So actually, before Kinetic commissioned me and before I'd done anything with my composer hat on, I worked for 4 years as an intern for Kinetic. And I would do kind of publicity stuff, and occasionally I would like badly do music librarian work. Oh. But for me, that was like such a learning experience. And I think just to see how this small nonprofit works, both on the creative side and also from the kind of administrative and organizational side, it was such a wonderful learning experience. And I think one of the best parts of it was I got to know the musicians, not just kind of professionally, but also as friends, which was great. And that ended up turning into so many creative projects from there.
Well, yeah, and that's where it's even more meaningful that you're on our first album. It feels like a family sort of thing, that we all did this together and it's a team effort.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things about Kinetic is that even though at this point so many of the members live in different cities other than Houston, but still everyone still comes back to play with this group. And I feel like it sounds better every time I hear the orchestra too, which is really incredible.
Thanks, Paul. Well, would you mind sharing your most insane performance or audition story?
Absolutely. So I actually have two, one of which is insane in a good way and one of which is insane in just a chaotic way.
Okay.
So I think I'll start with the chaotic one just because I think it's funny. So I grew up in Reno, Nevada, which I think was a musical culture that I really gained so much from growing up. I think there's like a really thriving community of musicians there, and there's so much wonderful music being made. But because it is Nevada, sometimes things are a little bit skewed. And so some of the gigs that I got offered in high school were especially kind of strange. So I'm a flutist as well as a composer, and especially back when I was in high school, that was something I was very serious about, and I would gig a lot and play a lot. And there was a gig that I got offered every single Christmas, which was to play in a wind quintet in the ballroom of a casino.
Oh.
And what was so funny about this gig is that it was a wind quintet playing Christmas carols, and people were gambling while we were playing them.
Yeah.
And there was always some sort of drunken chaos going on as we were just like trying to stay together, and no one could hear us anyway.
Yeah, right.
But
could you even hear each other?
Barely. We're just like, cueing dramatically, and I'm conducting with my flute, and But for some reason, that just really stuck in my head of like the drunken chaos going on while like we're just playing Jingle Bells up on stage.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my most insane performance story. My craziest story, but in a good way, was something that actually happened at Rice. And I think in many ways, this was kind of a jumping off point for a lot of things that I'm still really interested in and doing a lot of. This was a project that someone in the architecture school had reached out to me about. And the reason that someone from the architecture school even knew who I was not because I was like such a big name composer. It was just because my partner is an architect. So I had like some nepotism going through there.
Well,
every year at Rice, the architecture school puts on this huge kind of reception gala event called Archi-Arts. And for this year, they were doing a charrette competition, which is where they have a bunch of different teams of architects working together, all kind of on the same problem or the same kind of prompt. And what they did for this year was they wanted to use one of my pieces as the prompt. So to have the architects design a built environment inspired by my piece.
Whoa.
And it would be a built environment for dancers. And what ended up happening was they picked this wonderful environment that was designed by several Rice architecture undergrads. And then they built it in the architecture school. And what it ended up being was this environment, which was then manipulated by the dancers of Rice Dance Theater. And it was performed with my piece, Debussy Palimpsest.
Whoa!
And I just remember, like, at the time, felt so honored and so blown away by the talent of all these people I was working with. And it was this type of interdisciplinary project where there were so many different things happening. There were performers, there was a composer, there were 3 dancers, there were 3 designers who had, like, built this entire thing from scratch. And I feel like in many ways that experience really has gone forward into my work now, because I'm still so interested in interdisciplinary stuff like that. And in many ways it's sort of become really the core of what I do, is trying to work with artists in other disciplines. So I feel like for me that was just like this eye-opening experience, which also kind of launched me off to new things.
Yeah, that's really cool. It seems like a silly question because it's so simple, but I guess I've always sort of wondered what it's like on the other side, me being a performer talking to a composer. What's it like to watch people be inspired by you and your music?
Well, I don't know. I think for me, the best type of collaborations do not have any hierarchy to them at all. So it's like not just that someone is being inspired by me, it's that I'm being inspired by them too. And there's this sort of equality. For me, that's like the ideal type of collaboration where you're really kind of partners. And it's not like, I don't know. I think that in classical music especially, there's this historical idea of what a composer is that's like at the top of the totem pole, right? Like everything we do is honoring this tradition of composers. And for me, at least, I found that that is not really a way I like to work at all. And I would much rather sort of be on an equal playing field where I'm working with performers who are, and we're sort of exchanging ideas back and forth and building a piece together. Like to me, that's a really special and beautiful way of working.
Yeah. I guess I was sort of coming from the perspective of the fact that architects were building a building based on your piece. And that's like a whole different level of collaboration.
It was, yeah. And it was actually like a really special thing because the way that architects think, I think, is very different from the way that composers and performers think. Whereas performers and people in the classical music world were very concerned about practicality and about the physics of sound. And I think for architects, they tend to approach things from a much more conceptual angle. And what was so interesting about this is that all of the different teams approached my piece from a very different conceptual angle. And the piece that was being performed was called Debussy Palimpsest. And the whole idea of the piece was that it was like a vandalism of Debussy's trio for flute, viola, and harp.
Oh, okay.
Where I had taken this piece, which I adore, and I'd written new music on top of it and disintegrated it and taken it apart in a lot of ways. So a lot of their ideas were also informed by this idea of palimpsest, of vandalism. And so that was really cool to see. But even though they all kind of came from that conceptual angle, they all looked so different just aesthetically. So it was a really special experience.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Well, that's really cool. And retrospectively, congrats for that.
Yeah, thank you. One other thing that is a cool connection was that the violist on that performance actually was Sebastian Stefanovic, who's also in Kinetic too. So it all comes back to this really wonderful core group of musicians who
that's wonderful.
I met through Kinetic and have been working with ever since.
Yeah, it's the best. Yeah. And I love it when things like that come around, like such a small world. Not just, I guess, in the music world, but also, I mean, with you and your connections to the architect school at Rice and everything too.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think, and I'm sure this is something that you and many of the musicians who listen to this podcast are familiar with, but I think that often when you have a really intense musical connection with someone, it becomes a friendship too. Yeah. And that's a really wonderful thing. Yeah.
So you mentioned to me that you are about to adopt a little kitty cat?
I am. Yeah. So this has been a long time coming. My partner moved to Chicago in May and we were traveling a lot and moving into a new apartment, and we had been wanting to adopt a pet, but got put on hold for a little bit. And then we finally decided we would wait until after the holidays this year, after we were traveling and got back, and then we were going to adopt a cat. So I think we're going to go to the shelter next weekend and pick out either a single cat or a bonded pair, but we are so excited.
Do a bonded pair, then you get 2 kitties. I'm sorry. I'm just living vicariously through you. Yeah. Yes.
I feel like it's been so hard not having a cat around for the last couple months, so I'm really excited for it.
Yeah. Well, so clearly by the time that this episode will air, you will have adopted, hopefully, at least one or two kitty cats. So I guess names to be determined, or?
Yeah, oh my gosh. So we have an incredibly long list of names for cats running, some of which are like very kind of serious people names, and some of which are just like crazy, stupid, silly cat names,
Yes.
which I think is one of the best things about naming cats, because some people take it very seriously and give them human names, and some people will just name their cat like Coupon
Sushi.
or Microwave or Sushi. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think it depends on their personality, though. You got to meet them first.
That's how I see
decide.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please share with us photos, and we'll put it on the Instagram when you do adopt your little kitties.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
All right. Are you ready for some Spitfire questions?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Robert Schumann or Johannes Brahms?
Brahms.
Tchaikovsky or Stravinsky?
Stravinsky.
Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate.
Apples or oranges?
I think apples.
Okay. Favorite zoo animal to see?
I love aviaries. Okay, this will make this a little bit less
sense.
Spitfire. Yeah. Patty can probably see right behind me, there's like a picture of a bird on the wall. I love birds. The piece of mine that you played was about birds.
You gave me a bird too, like a little.
I gave you a tiny little bird. Yeah.
So just the aviary, not a particular bird in general.
I think there's something amazing about those aviaries. They have a particular zoos where you have like the birds swooping on top of you, and they're all kind of in their own built environment, which is really cool.
Yeah. Fan favorite question. Favorite concerto for any instrument in any genre?
Ooh. This is tricky because I actually haven't written a concerto, no. But I think there are a couple concertos that I just adore, one of which is the Ligeti Piano Concerto. I think that the Takamitsu Flute Concerto is another one. I will say that I think that, in general, I have a preference towards wind concertos, and it's because I am a flutist, and so those were the ones that I grew up playing and are very close to my heart.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Yeah. Last show you recommended to a friend?
Probably White Lotus, which I'm kind of obsessed with right now.
Okay, I'm sorry. Where is that streaming?
It's on HBO, and it's both very, very silly, but it's also, I don't know, very resonant and powerful.
Could you do
Highly
a
recommend.
quick synopsis of it?
Sure, yeah. So there are 2 seasons of it out, and each of the seasons centers around like a resort where there's all of these different rich people who are coming and interacting with the people who live in the place where the resort is. The first one is in Hawaii, and the second one is in Italy. And then there's like this kind of sense of impending ominous things that's going to come, because you know that for both of the seasons they end with a death, but you don't know who's going to die. And so it's sort of a murder mystery, but it's also very much about like these different families that are coming here on vacation and interacting with each other, and just kind of drama and shenanigans that go down.
Okay, that sounds like a good show. Yeah.
It's great. And Tanya is the best character to ever be written on television, and I love her. So
awesome.
highly recommend. Yeah.
Favorite Disney hero or heroine and villain?
Ooh, I think Ursula is definitely my favorite villain. I almost said my favorite hero, but she's definitely not the hero.
Well, why though?
I mean, I think for pure camp and just like queer goals, I guess.
Sure, okay.
Yeah, my favorite Disney hero. I don't know. I think there's something about being queer where you tend to be more drawn towards Disney villains than Disney heroes in general. Sure. Yeah, let's go with Ursula as my favorite hero and villain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Worst travel story?
Oh my God. So this is actually coming to mind because of all the recent stuff that's gone down about Southwest in the last few days. This exact same thing happened to me with Southwest like 7 years ago, where they, I think, had some computer error or something, and they canceled all the flights for a day. And I finally got to the front of the line, and they were like, oh, the next flight we can put you on is in 8 days.
What?
Yeah. And eventually I ended up just taking another airline, but I ended up getting trapped in Albany for 2 days. And it was just a total nightmare. And it was not because of weather. It was just because like Southwest is you get what you pay for.
They need to upgrade their system. They need to just like invest in themselves.
They do. I'm so conflicted though too, because it's also the perfect airline for irresponsible people like me who constantly have to change their flights. So I go back and forth,
Yeah, I get it. That sucks though. I'm sorry you had that experience. Favorite professor shout out?
I feel like one of the best mentors I've ever had was Kurt Stallman at Rice University. I love you, Kurt. Shout out to you. I mean, I think Kurt, both as a teacher, he is just one of the most thoughtful professors who is able to engage with students who come from so many different aesthetics, which is a really hard thing to do as a composer, because often you bring your own kind of aesthetic baggage with you. And he's so good at really approaching it with empathy. And when he's working with a student, he really sort of tries to see it from their perspective as opposed to from his own perspective, which is a really, really special, wonderful thing. I also think that just so much about having a teacher in music is not about like literally the notes that you're working on, but it's about sort of the emotional side of things and the professional side of things. And he just has continued to be like a really important mentor who, whenever there's some big decision I need to make, he's one of the first people I call. So I feel so grateful to him for that.
Yeah. Hugs to Kurt.
Yes, exactly.
Most transformative performance experience?
Ooh. Well, one very transformative performance experience I had was actually in Thailand. This was, I think, maybe 5 years ago. This came about because one of the Rice composition faculty called me at like 10 p.m. and was like, hey, I have this performance opportunity for you. I think you should totally do this. It's in Thailand. You have to decide by tomorrow.
What?
and I was like, oh my God, what? But what it was this festival that this professor's friend, whose name was Koji Nakano, was putting on in Thailand. And the concept of the festival was that it was 5 composers from 5 different countries working with Thai traditional musicians. So basically, I spent 2 weeks in Thailand workshopping with the musicians. And what made this so transformative for me was that I got there and I knew that like they were not going to be able to read Western music. What I didn't know going in was that they also wouldn't speak English.
Right.
And so we were collaborating, but with the only language we had to communicate was musical. So I would come into rehearsals with my flute and sort of teach them the piece, and we would improvise together. I learned so much about Thai music during that time. It's an incredible system they have there where there's a wonderful network of conservatories of music, but not of Western classical music, of Thai traditional music. And one of the things that's so incredible is that the musicians there don't specialize in one instrument, and instead they know how to play all of the different instruments at an incredibly virtuosic level. And I learned so much about Thai art when I was there and got to experience so much wonderful art making. So that was a really transformative experience.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow, that's awesome. It's like, how do I not know this about you? Alternate universe musical instrument?
Honestly, cello, I think. I love the cello. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you don't have to tell me twice. Like, I'm biased, but yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a pretty versatile instrument.
It is, yeah. I feel like also
ticket.
it's my favorite instrument to write for, too, just because it has this incredible range. It has this lyricism, but also you can get so many different textures and sounds out of it. Love the cello. It's great.
Yay. Okay, well, you finished the Spitfire questions. Congratulations.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you. Okay, Paul, can you walk me through your musical origin story? How did you discover classical music? When did you decide to pursue it in general? And then also when you decided to start composing? And walk me through the steps of your compositional life and career and what that's looked like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk a little bit about how I started music. I think that for a lot of my life, I've had not just one musical life, but a couple different parallel musical lives all happening at the same time. And I think that the reason that is that I've always been someone who's very interested in a lot of things. So I started playing music when I was 10, and it was in 5th grade band. Okay. And I think that for me, it wasn't necessarily the feeling of playing an instrument that I really liked. It was the feeling of making music with other people. Mm-hmm. This is probably a very common thing for musicians, that it's that interactive social element of like you're contributing to something greater that really drew me to it. So I started playing the flute in 5th grade, and then from 6th grade up until the end of high school, I also played the oboe, which I was never very good at. The reason I was not good at it is that I was never very good at making reeds. Oh, yeah. But I don't know, I was always someone who really liked to pick up new skills, and so I was sort of always teaching myself to play all these different instruments. And I think for me, one of the biggest things that happened was that I started playing in bands around when I was 13 and 14 and started learning how to play this entire other kind of music, which was to play rock and pop music.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And there was one band I played with through most of high school, which was all people I went to school with, and they became some of my like closest friends.
What did you play in the band?
I played bass guitar. Okay. I played keyboards, and I sang backup. I mean, I'm a composer, so I wrote a lot of the songs too. Oh, okay. And I won't tell you where, but a lot of those songs are still out there on the internet and have very emo lyrics written by like 15-year-old Paul.
Fair, Paul. Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I was never the kind of person who had like amazing technique or super good technical background on all these instruments. But I think what I did have was a kind of curiosity. And I think I liked to kind of see how music worked. And I would really get obsessed with different types of music. And so I think that kind of side of my music making has always been a part of my composition too. And I think that those days of like songwriting and playing in bands and stuff, those still really inform the music that I make now. Alongside that, I played in youth orchestra and I would learn solo rep and I played in a woodwind quintet. And I feel like those experiences also very much made me the musician that I am today. And in particular, the feeling of playing an orchestra is something that has always stayed with me. I would say like kind of a current in the compositional world right now against the orchestra. And I think I can see where that's coming from a lot because in many ways, the orchestra represents hierarchy, right? It represents a lot of the things that are, I would argue, are wrong with the world of classical music.
Yeah.
But I also think it's just such an incredibly transformative experience to be making music with that many people at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's really nowhere else. Maybe in a choir would be the other
opera
situation.
Or something.
Or an opera. Yeah. But just to be contributing to that kind of sound and to be a part of that is a really wonderful thing. I also think to be a woodwind player in an orchestra is an especially wonderful thing because you're really playing chamber music even though you're a part of this much bigger ensemble. Everyone has their own part. And so I always really love doing that. And I continue to play too and play in orchestras now.
Oh,
too.
okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but these days I'm more of a composer. I think one other thing that happened when I was a really little kid that really changed my life, honestly, was that I'd been like kind of composing a little bit when I was, 11 and 12 in Finale Notepad, just, messing around.
Yep. It's like Finale Notepad, like 2000.
Right.
I'm trying to think what year it was. Yeah.
Truly the jankiest software ever created. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So the composer in residence of the Reno Philharmonic at the time was Sean Shepard, and he held like a little workshop for young composers, and barely anyone showed up. It was me and two other people. And after I met Sean, he really took me under his wing and mentored me for a couple years there. And that was sort of really how I started composing.
Oh, wow.
And what that ended up culminating in was the Reno Philharmonic played one of my pieces when I was 13.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and so that was like the moment for me where I was writing for orchestra and I had no idea what I was doing and I was just trying things out. And I wrote a piece called There Exists a Light in Spring for orchestra. And just to hear the orchestra writing the notes that I played, that was one of the things that was like, yeah, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that must be like for a 13-year-old, just like sitting back and just like getting this wave of sound that you made.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember being totally speechless, especially because I was a really shy kid too.
Sure.
Yeah, honestly, Sean is someone who has really continued to support me in a lot of ways. When he started the Composer Apprentice program at the National Youth Orchestra of the US in 2016, I was one of the first composer apprentices that he had for it. And then the craziest thing is that actually he is my teacher at the moment, because he's a visiting lecturer at University of Chicago.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so I feel like our careers have continued
Yeah.
to reconnect at certain times, which is really nice.
That's really sweet. Yeah.
Yeah. So you also asked a little bit about my career and what that has looked like.
Yeah.
And
well, I guess sorry to interrupt, but just because I feel like so much of Hidden Behind the Music Stand is so performance-based, and I have interviewed composers in the past, but I think that path is a little more elusive.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that has kind of become clear to me as I'm sort of trying to build my own career and I see all of my friends sort of doing the same thing is that there is not just one way to make a career as a composer. And in fact, so many people do it in their own ways. And I think that it's true of, in many ways, it's true for performers too, but especially for composers where there are a lot less institutional jobs available. Everyone kind of has to forge their own path. And a lot of what that looks like is making income from a ton of different sources, like through a combination of commissions and teaching and royalties and awards. And I think right now I'm in school, which means that I luckily have a bit of a cushion, which is really nice to be getting funding for that. But yeah, I mean, I think that something that I've been seeing happening a lot recently, and that I feel like is the type of career that a lot of my friends are building, which is really special, is that they work with a very specific group of musicians and write almost all their music for those musicians. And really what their compositional language is informed by the musicians that they're collaborating with. Like Wedding Ensemble as being such an incredible model for that. And I think there's a lot of other composers and ensembles that have really had that kind of close, intense collaboration be kind of their main way of working. There are also a lot of composers who are building careers in what's sort of the more old-fashioned way, which is working with lots of different ensembles and having kind of more of a maximalist approach, where they're doing lots of different work and collaborating widely. And I think of myself as trying to go somewhere in between, where I think I really like to create pieces that can have a life. And by that I mean that either an ensemble can kind of take and have this be a piece that gets performed again and that they'll bring, I don't know, when I write write a piece for an ensemble, I think for me, it's kind of my way of honoring them and their amazing musicianship. And then I think often, like, what I love to see is when they sort of honor it the same way by performing it a lot. So I think I like to create pieces that can kind of have a life and be performed by different ensembles. At the same time, I think some of my most fulfilling musical experiences have been the really close, intense collaborations where I'm writing multiple pieces for the same performers and really kind of getting to know their musical personalities. And I think one ensemble that I have had that kind of close relationship with is Black Box Ensemble in New York, which is a really young ensemble. It's a group of musicians who are the youngest are about my age and the oldest are maybe 6 or 7 years older than me.
Sure.
So mostly in their 20s. And for this ensemble's first concert, the artistic director and I knew each other all the way back from high school. And he had asked me to write a piece for their first concert. And I was like, oh yes, I would love to. And since then, that was in 2017. Since then, I've written a number of different pieces for them. And I think I've really gotten to know each of the musicians, not just on a musical level, but also like as a friend. And that's a really wonderful thing. For me, one of the most fulfilling things I did with them was this residency at a place called Avaloq Farm Music Institute.
Sure.
We did it in the summer of 2021. And it was during a time when a lot of us had not really made music in an intense way for a long time.
Sure.
And just to be there, and I would be writing music every night, and then we would kind of rehearse it and workshop it the next day. And to be doing that in this really intense and kind of wonderfully collaborative way after a year and a half of not making music was a really special thing.
Yeah. I was even thinking of like, how do you compose something every night? Like, how do you, after such a like time of just like, you know, everyone in the music field was just kind of on their butts during the pandemic. And then suddenly you're like, okay, overcharge. Like maybe that's where you build up a lot of inspiration during that time.
I honestly remember being so inspired during that time. Looking back on it, there was like an anxiety thing too, where I was like, I need to finish this piece by the time this residency's over so we can like get the recording out and stuff. But I think also just like to be there in person with people, not on Zoom, but actually like in the same space, being able to try things out. It was really inspiring. Yeah.
Well, it's like going back to your original love for making music was like collaborating interpersonally and in person. Like that's the big factor. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just after the pandemic, I appreciate it so much more. Just that interpersonal element and the collaborative aspect and getting to exist in the same space as the people I'm working with.
Yeah. Did you even attempt to do any kind of online version of collaboration with the internet in mind? Did you attempt any sort of version of that? Or were you just like, I'm just going to wait until...
Yeah, no, I feel like so many composers were doing these really inventive projects that were kind of taking advantage of the difficulties involving the technology and Zoom and everything. And that was really cool. I didn't do any pieces that were meant to be performed like that. But what I did write during 2020 was a lot of solo music. So I wrote especially the first couple months of the pandemic, I wrote a bunch of solo and duo pieces for friends who were quarantined together and ended up compiling those into a set, which is called Dances and Prayers in Isolation. I did a couple projects where the ensemble was there masked, and then I was in a different city on Zoom. And so that was actually the way that the piece that I wrote for Kinetic was premiered, which was that all the Kinetic musicians were in Houston performing together, and then I was in Chicago watching from my computer. I felt so grateful to be included on that concert and for that commission to happen. But it was hard too. Like I remember there was one rehearsal where there was a typical Houston rainstorm during the rehearsal. And on Zoom, I just heard like psh and couldn't hear any notes. Yeah. And Siggy, the violist, was like, oh, so what do you think? And I was like, thumbs up. Like,
I'm sure it sounded great.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, this is all just to say that I feel like I appreciate the in-person music making so much more.
We all do. Like with a sigh of relief, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So what are your current upcoming projects that you're looking forward to in 2023?
So one project that I am working on right now really gets back at the project that I was talking about before with the architects and the dancers. And in many ways, it's actually a very similar project. And this is a project that I'm curating at University of Chicago in collaboration with DanceWorks Chicago, which is a local dance company. And the way that we've set up this project is it's 4 composers and 4 choreographers collaborating together. We're working with 5 musicians and a dance company of 6 dancers. And I'm working with a poet actually on my piece too. One of the things that was really important to me was that we didn't prescribe a certain way of collaborating. We could be like, you can do this however you want. You can start with the music, you can start with the dance, you can kind of work on both at the same time. And really each of the different teams has done something totally different. And I think that's been really cool and special to see unfold. The poet and the choreographer who I'm working with, I think we've really found that we are interested in so many of the same things, both like conceptually and also like aesthetically. And the piece that we are working on together, which I just finished the music for, and the choreographer Mark is just beginning to do the choreography for, is called Ghost Story. And we all kind of came together with this kind of shared fascination with the genre of the ghost story and also with queerness. And so the whole idea for this piece is it's like a gay ghost story. And it's sort of about how queerness and queer trauma can sort of be a kind of spectrality or like a haunting on the body.
Wow.
And Victoria Flanagan, who's the poet we're working with, wrote the most gorgeous, incredibly powerful poem, which I set to music. And yeah, I think it's going to be a really special performance. So I'm excited for that. One other piece, the piece that I'm working on right now is for Chicago's Civic Orchestra. And I think I talked a little bit before about how I feel like orchestra is kind of in my DNA. It's really made me the musician that I am today. And I think also for me, it's like this wonderful kind of sandbox of like, this is what you can do with this many musicians on stage. And I think writing for orchestra is really challenging too, especially when you get used to the rehearsal time of chamber music and the rehearsal style of chamber music. Yeah. Getting used to the like really fast turnaround and everything is really different. But for this piece, I'm wanting to write a piece that really kind of showcases how fantastic this orchestra is and has kind of a little showcase for each of the different sections. So almost like a little concerto for orchestra.
Okay, sort of that's cool. Yeah.
And then the last piece that I am working on this spring, which I'm really excited for, is a commission from this wonderful organization called Links Project in Chicago. And they do a lot of really wonderful, inclusive, and very progressive programming. This year, they've commissioned 5 composers as part of their Amplify series. And the composers, they've paired each with a neurodiverse poet. So this year, we're all collaborating with autistic poets who are primarily non-speaking. And for me, this has been just such a wonderful, wonderful experience. The poet I'm collaborating with is named Parker Shu, and his poem is just really beautiful and vivid and full of all these incredibly detailed images. And so for me, it's been just a joy setting to music.
Well, I was just thinking how beautiful that is, that, again, similar to, you said non-speaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's similar to the collaboration you were mentioning with not being able to communicate in the same language with the Thai people that you were immersing yourself with, and that it's sort of the language that is connecting you is both music and, I guess, like written word or something.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like 2
absolutely.
art forms that are coming together.
Totally. I love you drawing that connection. I think something else that I just really love about this commission and about everything that Links does is that they are so interested in accessibility in classical music, which to be a performing musician, you sometimes forget just how inaccessible these spaces are, like that they require you to be there often dressed up, sitting still and quiet for like such a long period of time. And
no coughing.
I think they, yeah, exactly. And I think that Links is really interested in crafting concerts that are like accessible to everyone, which is really special. And I think also they're really interested in amplifying voices that are typically excluded from the world of classical music too, which is, it's really special to be a part of that project. And very needed. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that sounds amazing. Congrats on all your future projects. And I can't wait to see all the success from your performances that are to come.
Oh, thank you so much, Patty.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, are you ready to take a break?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. Hey friends, are you enjoying this episode and are excited for more content to come? Consider becoming part of the Hidden Behind the Music Stand family on Patreon. Any contribution level helps keep the podcast alive. That's at patreon.com/hiddenmusicstand. Other ways to support are to recommend episodes to friends and family and to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It's quick, easy, and a free way to spread the word about my fantastic guests and all the incredible accomplishments they achieve in the music world. Also, feel free to reach out to us through social media at Hidden Music Stand and by email hiddenmusicstand@gmail.com. Thanks, and enjoy the episode. Welcome back from the break. So, Paul, you wanted to talk about poetry, and that's such a big topic, and I'm almost a little overwhelmed of where to start. Maybe, like, who's your favorite poet?
Yeah. So, who's my favorite poet? I mean, I think Maggie Nelson is someone whose work I've been really, really into for a couple of years now. And so she's definitely up there for my favorite poets. I think that for me, poetry has been such an amazing art form to read and to learn from and also to write myself.
I didn't know you wrote.
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think.
So you compose poetry too.
I think for me, it's in some ways, I feel like it's part of my DNA because my mom is actually a poet.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, she's a professor of English at University of Nevada, and she's a poet. And so I think there was always kind of poetry around when I was growing up, and I read a lot of it growing up, but I think I always kind of kept some distance from it too, just because I didn't want to be like my parents. And it's really only in the last couple of years that I've started writing it and started to see the connections and also the differences with music. And I think alongside my own poetic work and interest in poetry and my own reading has been my collaboration with poets too. Mm-hmm. I have talked a little bit about how I'm really interested in interdisciplinary work, and probably the biggest part of that has been working with text creators of different kinds. So whenever I'm writing a vocal piece, now I will just call up some of my friends who are poets and we'll work together on the piece, and I really like doing that.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about. When you were just speaking, a little spark went in my brain of when you said the differences between, what did you call them? Text artists?
I say text creators, not just because often I'll work with people who are not in the traditional sense of poet. I've worked with spoken word artists, for example.
Oh, sure. But you were saying you were fascinated by the differences between text creators and music creators or composers, right? That kind of in your own composition of poetry. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, what have you found? What has been the main difference between the two art forms?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll
other than the obvious.
Yeah, right. Maybe I'll start with the similarities, and then I can talk about the differences a little bit. Yeah. For me, one of the things that is most similar is thinking about emotion in an abstracted way. And I feel like that's a huge part of the way that I approach music too, is that you're doing something which is, in many ways, it's sort of purely emotional, right? It has no concrete semantic meaning, but also there's a way that you can craft a specificity to it too. And I think often, for me, the experience of reading poetry has that same specificity, even though in many ways, poetry is less abstract than music, but it still often has a lot of elements of abstraction to it. I also think that the way that poets think about form is very similar to the way that composers think about form. For example, I think we often think about the measure and the phrase are kind of two main units of time in music, right? Where the measure is how it shows up on the page, and the phrase is this thing which extends beyond the measure and is much larger than that. I think that in poetry, the way that the line versus the sentence, it works almost exactly the same way. And I think that I tend to be very interested in poetry, which is, it's called enjambed poetry, where rather than just having a sentence per line, the sentences don't map evenly onto the lines. And for me, that creates a sense of tension, which I really like.
Yeah, I have to admit, sometimes reading that poetry gets me, well, I guess I should admit something further, which is that I feel very amateurish when I read and appreciate poetry. I didn't have the kind of background that you did with it. I mean, maybe I read Shel Silverstein, but that's not the same level of, that's a little...
I don't know. I mean, I think for me, no, yeah, first of all, I completely agree. Not everyone has a poet as their mom, which definitely makes things a little different. But I also feel for me, what poetry for me is it's just using words in kind of an abstract way. And I think there's such a long history of the form, but to me, that's what it always comes down to.
Right. So this is where, for me, I think poetry has confused me in the past because I think I'm more literal or direct. And so when I see the spacing, I'm like, wait, why is there a space there? And I get all kind of, but that's why I say now I'm more amateurish because I now can kind of understand what the purpose is. And anyway, but that's just where when you're talking about reading that kind of poetry, what did you call it again?
So that's called enjambment.
Enjambment, yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of enjambment poetry is where I still kind of getting over a hump a bit. In my amateurish eyes, though, when I read poetry that is spaced like that, though, it does emphasize certain phraselets or words more. And maybe that's similar to an accent or a crescendo to something or something along those lines. Is that a comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think often that is why enjambment is used, is it changes the emphasis from the first word of every sentence into, you can have kind of more detail and more craft in how you're doing it. I think, though, maybe an even more musical way of thinking about it is that often the reason you have lines of different length is that it changes the speed of your reading. So when you have a line that's really long, it makes you read it quite quickly, right? Because you're reading it almost like it's in a paragraph or something. Whereas when you have a line that's really, really short, it forces you to slow down and take more time with it. And so it's almost like the tempo of the poem is changing with different line lengths, which is,
Gotcha.
I think that's a very kind of compositional way that poets think about it. And often you'll see like the lines that kind of hit the hardest in a poem that are really the core are super short because they sort of want you to slow down for them. And that's something that I think is really interesting and is totally a connection with composition.
Yeah. So now the differences?
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things that I found most challenging about working with poets and setting poetry, and the reason that I think this is challenging is that it is one of the things that is most wonderful about poetry, but is most hard about setting poetry. What that is leaps between ideas. And so I think that especially in poetry from the 20th century on, the kind of poetic leap is a really important way of how poems work, where often you have these two things that are juxtaposed or more than two things, and you're jumping back and forth between them. And that element of the leap between things that seem unrelated but are actually connected by being in the same poem, some would say that's like the basis of poetry. That is like the poetic right there. For me as a composer, I'm interested in that leap, but I also find it really challenging. And so often when I'm working with poetry that has that kind of aspect of leaping a lot, it presents some real musical challenges to set to music. And I think that's something that I always struggle with a little bit. Like I think often when you are working with a text, you're sort of trying to create a background that can work for it as a whole. And so when it's jumping back and forth between all these different things, you're not sure whether to focus on the aura of a particular line or the aura of the stanza as a whole or the aura of the poem as a whole. It's hard to know what kind of scale to focus on.
Yeah, I can't relate because I don't compose, but I can sympathize. When you're talking about that though, I'm sure this isn't the only way to do it, but what came to my mind in music is, well, it's like juxtaposing two tonality systems together. So like one harmony above another harmony at the same time. And I'm sure you've probably done that, or I don't know, it's like one way of, but is that a similar musical way that this poetic leap that you're talking about could be seen in music?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're totally spot on there. Like so much music, at least in my mind, is structured like a dialogue or a conversation, whether between different instruments or like you said, between different tonalities or between different rhythms or textures or however you want to think about it. Like music to me is conversation. You know, I'm very interested in kind of the interactive social elements of music making, and that's really the way I see music. And I think in many ways, a poem does exactly the same thing, especially this kind of leaping poetry, which is about many different things. And in that leap is sort of the interest in the poem for me. I think that often, just historically, there have been so many connections between poetry and music too. The way that poetic form has influenced music making is really incredible too.
Do you want to share certain examples that have inspired you? Would you like to? Sorry.
Let me think. Yeah. Maybe just to go back, like super far back in the history of poetry, there was a long period of time where poetry was not written down. It was an oral tradition, right? And it was spoken, or maybe not even spoken, but sung. Like, for example, like thinking of the Odyssey and the Iliad and all these like ancient Greek epic poems. We don't know exactly what the performance practice for those would have looked like, but I can totally imagine it being sung too, especially when we think about like the rhythm and the sound of those words. I think the two art forms are so kind of inextricably intertwined.
So when you're talking about the Odyssey and Iliad and those sorts of things and focusing on, or Beowulf, I guess, is also technically a poem, right? Yeah. So those kinds of old poems and focusing on the rhythm and sort of phrase or even things that are sung or whatever. To me, there's also that performative aspect of poetry. When you go to like a poetry reading or something like that, that elevates the poem outside of reading it on the page. I mean, yes, you can go to like book readings and stuff like that, but it's poetry and literature and in general is just, it's like a different sect of the overall text creators that you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So how much of that, of just the experience of going to a poetry reading or even speaking the poetry yourself, how does that influence your musicianship?
For me, it's super, super important. And for me, thinking of a composer, whenever I'm setting a text, something I'm really interested in is not just what the words mean, but also the literal sound of the words. And so I have a lot of pieces actually where I'll like take a text and break it down into its individual phonemes. So rather than hearing an entire word, you'll just hear little syllables. And then from there, I'll kind of build together the words. And yeah, that's sort of a process of taking sound and turning it into meaning. That's something I'm very interested in. One other aspect of the culture of poetry that's been like really important to me is getting to workshop my own poems and be a part of the workshop setting. Something that's so special about, and I think I should also say I feel really lucky that the workshops that I've been part of have been super healthy and really powerful ways to learn from each other, which I know is not always the case. But something that I think is really different from the way that we workshop in music is that there is no sense of hierarchy at all. And so it's everyone reads a little bit of a poem and then everyone kind of talks about it and gives suggestions and gives ideas. And there's a real vulnerability there to share something that is in progress. And I think it also involves like such a huge amount of trust. For me as a composer, I don't know that I'd ever been in a type of artistic setting with that much vulnerability too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me it was a really special thing. I think also there's a real vulnerability too, because often people's poetry is very personal. And when you're reading their poetry and hearing them recited, they're really trusting you with a very personal, important part of themselves. And so, yeah, I think there's a real power in those types of spaces.
What types of topics do you gravitate toward in poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, poetry has often been a window into things that I don't know. I feel that I can express publicly in a lot of ways. Okay. For me, my poetry is a very internal part of myself. One of my friends joked to me recently that like all of my poems are about how I want to like drop out of school. And I don't know, I think for me, a lot of poems are an exploration of queerness in a lot of different ways and the many different forms that it can take. I'm very interested in dreams in my poems too. I have a couple of poems that are dream catalogs where they're these kind of list poems that are just drawing from images of things that I've dreamed and putting them together. And for me, dreams are such an interesting thing because whether or not they actually mean anything, they seem to mean something. Just in taking these images and putting them side by side, I feel like you can reveal so much about the speaker, who is in this case just explicitly me. Yeah. Those are some of the topics that I tend to gravitate towards.
So you said that you usually ask your poet friends or something to supply poetry for the compositions that you want to compose. I have a kind of multi-layered question. Like, do you ever use your own poetry? Have you used your mom's poetry? And are there any particular poets or poems that you specifically are working on or wanted to share with us so that we then can read it later or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. You started by asking whether I've ever set my own text to music. And it's something that I've only recently kind of started to do. I did it about a year ago. It's very vulnerable, yeah. And I think that in some ways, this is maybe like a limiting binary, but I think that for me, often my composition feels like it's an externalization of my artistic self, and poetry feels like an internalization. Like this is largely just for me. It's not for sharing with the world. But actually, for the first time ever last year, I did write a piece, and it was sort of drawing together a couple of those dream poems that I was talking about, and the piece is called Dream Catalog. It was a tricky thing to do because I think that often the things that make those dream poems interesting and make them, at least for me, work as poems is the specificity to my own life. And there were some things that I felt like I couldn't put in a piece. So I actually had to filter it a little bit. And so that piece is getting played this May, and I'm really interested to hear how it works. And basically what that poem is it's just a list of images of objects that I saw in my dreams. So I think at some point I will probably set one of my mom's poems to music, but it's something I've actually never done yet. And I think that maybe part of it is like wanting to have an artistic identity that feels like it's mine. Sure, but I don't know, maybe something I'll do at some point in the future. I feel really grateful to some of the poets who I've been working with for a couple years, just in that I've really gotten to see the amazing breadth of some of their work. I've started to see them grow. One poet who I've written a couple pieces with now is Ira Goga, who's a poet around my age, who's based in New Hampshire. One of the things that I really love about their work and also about our collaborative style is that whenever I have a question about a poem, I can just reach out to them and be like, hey, can we talk about this? What does this mean? Like, how would you feel about if I set it to music this way or this way? And they're so open to those conversations. I really value that a lot. And then Victoria Flanagan is the other poet I've been working with recently, who's I'm collaborating with on the piece for dance. And I also feel like just in terms of the conceptual background of our work, we've really found some wonderful common ground and developed this wonderful friendship alongside our collaboration. So I really love that a lot.
I'm sure it's positive, but could you provide some more specifics about the reception you get from the poets that you collaborate with? Because I'm sure for them, I'm assuming they're not thinking about music and what their text is going to sound like put to music. So I'm kind of curious from their perspective what that experience is like.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see. And I think it's been such an eye-opening experience for both of us in a lot of ways. Something I've noticed is that different poets really like to collaborate in different ways, where for some poets, once the text is done, they sort of treat it like it's out of their hands. And I think they're very interested in what I'm doing musically, but they would sort of prefer to not be too involved in that side of things. And then I've also worked with poets who really kind of like to get their hands dirty a little bit and who I kind of feel comfortable running musical ideas by and being like, hey, I'm trying to decide whether I want to set this word this way or this way. What do you think? And I love that kind of collaboration. It's so great. And I think often, like I said, there's a lot of abstraction in poetry, and it's so amazing just to be able to like lean over to your friend and be like, hey, so what's this about? Like, can we talk about this? It's like looking behind the curtain a little bit.
Do you always set the text of poetry in your music, or have you ever just taken a poem and written a piece of music without the words in there? Do you always put voice to the text that you select for inspiration from poetry, or do you ever just take the poem and then write an instrumental piece?
That's a great question. Yeah. So I've written a lot of pieces actually that are inspired by text in different ways. So I think that's something that I actually do quite a bit. Often when I'm like kind of looking for inspiration for a piece, I'll go to other art forms just as like a place to start. And often it sort of comes down to like something I've read recently that I found really exciting or illuminating. Yeah. So a couple pieces that are recent that I've done that in. I wrote a piece for Sebastian actually a couple years ago called To Grow in Lightness, which is inspired by a writer who I really love, Italo Calvino, and his book Invisible Cities. And I have a couple other pieces that are inspired by fiction or poetry in this way too, or at least kind of using an idea from them as like a launching point.
Are there any genres of poetry that you have yet to dive into? And what are they?
So I think that one genre of poetry that I've always found very intimidating is long form poetry. And this is true both to write and to read and especially to set to music. To write it, something that I feel like I've gotten much more confident in my own kind of poetic work is doing a lot with a little. And so I tend to write very short poems, usually like less than a page. But there are so many of my favorite poets who really excel at long form poetry and at like weaving together this narrative of a lot of different parts, but in one poem. And I mentioned Maggie Nelson at the beginning of this section, and Maggie Nelson is a poet who does that so amazingly. And what she does is it's like almost a combination of poetry and memoir and literary theory in this absolutely amazing kind of tapestry. She has a book called Bluets. That's one of my absolute favorite books. And then I think to set to music too. This is something, to set long form poetry to music, to me has always seemed like this huge challenge, because often when you are setting a text to music, it's much slower than when you're reading it out loud, right? Because to sing, often you move much slower and you repeat words sometimes or repeat entire sentences sometimes. And so to approach like a poem of huge length, it means that you'll have some challenges, right? And you don't want to like rush through a text because often it's so rich. You want to give it the kind of attention it deserves. It's something I'm interested in the future. I mean, I think like opera as a genre is something I'm really interested in and would love to do at some point in my life. And so, I think it's certainly something I'm thinking about for the future. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Is there something about when you compose your own poetry that informs future musical compositions that you do?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that it does. But one thing that comes to mind right now is the use of tension. And I think that for me, something I'm really interested in poetry is the kind of creation and then release of tension. I think that there's a lot of ways that poets do it, but one of the main ones is something I already mentioned, which is enjambment. And there's a way that kind of poets can create this tension that you feel in your body. And I think that's something that music is able to do too. And for me, it's very satisfying when like you build up this tension and you build up this tension and then you finally release it. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I don't remember who it was, but there was some professor of mine that was like speaking of music only, but that all music is tension release. Just everywhere in little doses and then macro doses kind of thing. And so when you're saying, I don't know if that's just like reducing music to just something so simple as tension release, but it's interesting that you're pointing that out in poetry because I was like, oh, I guess that is the case as well. Whereas like even in a novel or something, that's just like a long-winded version of building tension to the climax and then denouement is the like resolution and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But that's just like a longer form of it. Yeah.
Totally. No, I liked what you said about like how there's like kind of macro tension and release, and then there's also micro tension and release. And I think that's true of poetry too. Yeah, absolutely. I think also something that's true of poetry that I think is also true of music is that often there is the moment in a poem which I had a teacher call the revelation section of the poem, which is like the moment where like it kind of becomes clear what this poem is actually about. And this is the moment that kind of sticks with you. And for me, in like a lot of the music that I love, there's a moment in that piece too that also is the one that really affects me. And maybe it isn't even what the piece is about, but it's like that's the moment that hits the hardest.
Yeah. When you said that, for whatever reason, a piece that just shot in my mind that's like that is Webern's 5 Movements for String Quartet.
I love that piece. Yeah. Just the miniatures in general.
Yeah. But particularly the third movement, because, well, already a lot of people kind of find 12-tone serialism to be a little bit abstract, and it's not tonal or has a melody necessarily. But then at the very end of that particular movement, the entire quartet is in unison in notes and rhythm. And it's as if, like, oh, finally we get that punchline of, oh, that's what this whole thing was about. And the journey to get there was, to me, that was like the poetic nature that what you were talking about.
Yeah, I love that analogy a lot. And I also think that's such an interesting observation too, because I know there's some quote out there, and I'm going to be totally paraphrasing it, but I think Schoenberg said that he and Berg were novelists, whereas Webern was a poet. Because all of his pieces were so kind of short miniatures and also kind of crystalline, like they're so kind of perfectly constructed and how they were. I also think the idea that like it has a punchline to me is so interesting too, because that's totally how I think about music too. And I think especially when I'm writing fast music, there's often a moment where, you know, everyone ends up together and it's almost like a resolution of building tension or something.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. And I'm curious to now take that idea of the poetic revelation and apply it to some of the pieces I'm working on.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure it's everywhere, whether or not composers of today or yesterday purposely put that in there.
Totally. And I feel like, for me at least, it almost like goes against everything I was taught in music school. Because I feel like in music school, often what you're taught is that it's like the entirety of the piece that's really important, right? Like it's the overall form that you're trying to bring out, and you're really interested in large scale structure. I feel like a lot of the time that's how composition is taught. But I have to say, my experience of listening to music and loving music, the thing that really draws me to a piece is rarely like the overall form, and it's almost always one particular moment. You know, there's like one moment that's like, this is why I like this.
You know what? I think it's a really interesting idea and concept, because I feel like one overarching sort of complaint for some people who are maybe new to classical music or are a little bit less familiar with the art form in general is the length. And the duration and building this attention span, so to say, to sit through a Mahler symphony or something along those lines. And I think it's kind of an interesting concept to think about it like, no, let's like actually flip it on its head and do a smaller version of that and not focus so much on the, as you say, the big macro scale of the structure or something like that. Make one thing really interesting and poignant.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think what it sort of brings me back to, and it's not just true for music and poetry, I think it's true for like really all kinds of art, but that like the pleasure of art is granular. Like it's in really tiny things. It's rarely in like something huge. At least that's my own experience. Like so often I'm listening to music and there's like one lyric that hits me really hard and it makes me listen to something over and over again. Yeah.
Right. But then that's the thing too, is that like if we really break down art and expression and overall, it's like it's always about one little poignant thought that then is like, oh, but then that triggers you to afterward when you're walking down the street to think about the bigger concept. It's not like one has to like tell you what the big concept is and you must think about that and stew in it, right?
Yeah.
It sort of like feeds itself to other ideas.
Totally. And it leads you into other things. And that's what gets you like inspired or excited or makes you feel emotion. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, totally.
Are there any other thoughts about poetry that you'd like to share before we transition to the final two questions?
Maybe one thing I'll say is that I think a lot of people are sort of like you mentioned, they're very intimidated by poetry or put off by it, because I think often when you approach a poem for the first time, you don't get it. And this is something that a lot of musicians will understand, but I think people doing all sorts of different work will understand, is that for me at least, the real pleasure in poetry is in rereading and kind of puzzling out what it's about. Not that it should be a puzzle, but that there's depth there, right? That there's different layers for you to peel back. And for me, at least, that's something that is the really wonderful thing about reading poetry.
Yeah. And so similar to classical music too.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think also that what people find as soon as they start reading poetry is that it's actually not as intimidating as they think too. And there's lots of people who are writing really funny poetry and really wonderfully kind of emotionally resonant poetry, and that it isn't a puzzle. It's expression, just like music.
It's only a puzzle if you haven't soul searched yourself. I don't know. I'm just making a joke. I don't know. Okay, well, thanks for illuminating me about poetry, specifically how you utilize it in your music, what relationships you developed with your poet friends, and I'm excited to take some of that and apply it in my own music making.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on to talk about it. I think something I should also say too is that I am not a poetry expert by any means. I am a poetry enthusiast, and I feel like I still have so much to learn and to grow in my own work as a poet, but I appreciate having a place to talk about this thing that I love.
Of course. May I ask you 2 final questions?
Yes, go for it.
What is one piece of advice you would tell your younger self about entering and pursuing a music career?
That's a good question. I think that something that I remember being so stressed out about for a lot of the time growing up was about feeling like I was behind. And I think a big part of that is because I grew up in Nevada. There weren't a ton of big cultural institutions. And I remember as soon as I kind of entered the world of classical music, I was meeting all of these other kids who had been doing it for so much longer than I had and at a really high level. And I think I had a lot of insecurity and a lot of anxiety because of that. I felt like I had something to prove, you know? And I think that the older I get, the more I realize that that was not a healthy place to be making art from. And I think also it created some kind of toxic habits in my own art making that I think I've been really trying to work through, you know, and to be making music because I love to do it and because I love the people I'm doing it with and not because of any other kind of outside pressures. Yeah. And I think that for so many people growing up in the world of classical music, this is something that they feel just, I think there's so many pressures, financial and cultural and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, that's a big topic. One I've tried chipping away at in the past on the podcast, but yeah, it's one of those things where it's really difficult because, and I mean, I'm not saying it's over. It's not, I mean, I'm sure we're constantly struggling with that kind of imposter syndrome or that kind of feeling of being behind or in some way or another. But at such a young age, it's even more exaggerated because you feel like you haven't done anything yet kind of thing, you know, because, you know, you just started in the field. So, but I think what I'm gathering from what you're saying is to remember that you do have a place and you do have a voice, despite what other people are doing around you.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And I think maybe even more than that I write better music when I'm not thinking about like all of those outside pressures. And instead I'm thinking about the music that I want to be making and the people that I'm making it with.
Isn't there a quote? Who is it? Is it Piazzolla or Gershwin? I can't remember which one. Maybe it's Gershwin that spoke to, like, was it Nadia Boulanger or some I can't remember. This is a really bad quote.
It was Gershwin. Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, the quote, I don't remember who the teacher was. I'm assuming it probably wasn't Nadia Boulanger. I don't remember who it was. But essentially, the premise of this is that write what you know and who you are and don't pretend to be somebody else. Because that's what everyone else is, that's what you're seeing from your vision.
Exactly. And I think that it's such a hard thing, right, to try and be authentic to who you are when you're still kind of figuring out who you are. I mean, I know I certainly am. But
we all are.
Yeah. I think it was Gershwin who went and took lessons with Ravel, and then Ravel said, no, I don't want you to write bad Ravel. I want you to write Gershwin, or something like that.
Thank you.
Something like
that.
Me.
Yeah. Oh my God.
I could be wrong, but yeah.
No, you're probably more right than me. Okay, listeners, I found the quote that I was looking for during the recording of this episode, and here's the quote from Ravel regarding Gershwin's music. Ravel reportedly replied, "Why would you want to be a second-rate Ravel when you can be a first-rate Gershwin?" So there's the quote, and now to the next question. And my second question, how has the pandemic changed your career?
That's a really interesting question.
Slightly talked about it, but maybe you have a different response.
It's changed my career in a lot of different ways. And I think the pandemic happened at a time which was really kind of formative for me. I mean, the pandemic hit when I was 21 years old. And I changed a lot, both on kind of a personal level and on a creative level during that time. And I think that like there's a lot of different ways that has shaped my career. But one thing that changed in a really big way is that the music I wrote changed a lot. And I think that like something I've become interested in a really huge way since the pandemic is this concept that I call collective virtuosity, which is basically that what makes music interesting is the coordination between the people who are making it and trying to write music that kind of requires a heightened level of artistic teamwork. You know, you've played my music. There's a lot of like very tricky coordination. And for me, at least, I feel like the feeling of finally getting things lined up and everyone's totally synced up is like the really satisfying thing. And
for us too. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that came through. Yeah. And I think that concept, which is really kind of about the social nature of music making, the collaborative nature of music making, has become increasingly important in my work. I think also just like the sound of my music changed a lot. During the pandemic, I started writing like a ton of really tonal pieces. And I think it was partly because I like wanted to write something that was comforting. You know, I wanted to write music that felt comforting to play and to write. And that's something that has really continued as a vein in my music. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I talked about this a little bit before, but I now feel like I value working in person with musicians so much more. And I think like that there's some ways that manifests like professionally. Like I think I now really work hard to be super efficient in rehearsal and to get what needs to be done, but in a way that's very like respectful. And I don't know, something that I think a lot of composers forget is that composition is all about communication, and the way you communicate in rehearsal is so important. And I think also just for me, like emotionally, I feel like now those moments of working with people in person are like the most fulfilling parts of being a composer.
Yeah. Aw. Well, I can certainly say from our perspective that was very appreciated throughout the recording process. It's just grueling in general to be under the microscope as a performer. But I mean, I just felt so at ease, and I trusted, and Brad's like keen ears. Like you guys are so great. So
yeah. Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And I mean, I never had any doubt that it's going to turn into like a really beautiful recording on the album. And I was so glad that we did that together.
Well, are there any places like a website or social media that you'd like to direct our listeners to learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. So you can hear a lot of my music and check out some of my pieces on my website, which is paulnovakmusic.com. I also post a lot about things I'm doing on Instagram too, and you can follow me at PLNVK_.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for having this wonderful discussion with me today. And it's always such a pleasure to see you, and even if it's virtual. And also that we have like such a mutual friend, Audrey. So please tell her I say hello.
Will do. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me, Patty. It was so great being on the podcast. Looking forward to catching up soon.
Yeah. And hopefully I'll play your music sometime in the near future as well.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, we're both in the Midwest. It's got to happen soon.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And thanks for listening. Say bye, Sushi.